Hey everybody, I'm going to keep this intro really brief and leap right into it. This is this month's discussion on LGBTQ plus topics and representation, and I have brought on special guest Em Middleton to talk about non-binary representation. I say talk about, really, I'm just giving them a platform and then getting out of the way, so let's go. Em, first of all, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Now, actually, do I have the honor of this being your video debut?
Yeah.
Yes!
I've been telling my roommate for years that she can't just start, recording me and putting me on the internet because I have a face made for radio. And then she found out that I was doing this yesterday. And so as soon as she found out, she was like, oh, so your face has already been on YouTube. And I'm like, oh, I feel like this is some sort of horrible Pandora's box that I've opened up for myself.
Yeah, we are going to have a conversation, or we're going to try to, about non-binary representation.
I'm really excited about this because you pitched this video to me months ago. And because our schedules are both sort of insane, it's taken a while for us to get together and talk. So I've just been slowly making notes. And I was kind of pleasantly surprised by the state of non-binary representation, especially for the last couple of years.
There were some promising things I found, but before we get into any specific representations, I want to make sure that anybody watching understands the terminology and what it is we're actually talking about. So how would you explain to someone your gender identity as non-binary?
So I would say that for me personally, what it means being non-binary is a sort of a lack of restrictions on the types of words that I am allowed to use for myself, and the freedom from sort of correlations, that because I might feel or present a certain way does not necessarily entail all of the other baggage that might come with it, that I am able to take on certain aspects of femininity, but that does not then equal must be woman, must be straight, etc., 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 all of which are untrue. Or because is masculine, must have certain interests, must behave certain way, must act certain way, must sound certain way. So it's sort of breaking those sort of correlations that we have about, well, if you are like X, you must also be like ABC. And it's like, no, those are actually all separate things that don't have to exist in a person simultaneously just because of their gender or their biological sex or the name or gender they were given at their birth. It's all about breaking boundaries, breaking binaries.
Yes.
Tearing down the walls.
It's looking at the categories and saying, no, actually.
Yeah. This is the perfect explanation that one of my fellow non-binary friends did a Twitter poll a couple of weeks ago and said, do I strike you as boy, girl? No. So some people would say both, and people like myself would say no.
When it came to my trying to find instances of non-binary representation, and part of the reason I had to do research and even take notes, that's huge for me, is because the instances that I found, not a single one was in anything I've ever seen.
Yeah, so there's a decent amount of non-binary representation if you either sort of expand your definition a little bit, or look at really, really, really fringe, very new things. That's where you're going to get a lot of your representation. As people have been more visual and have talked more about being non-binary and what it means to be non-binary and how one experiences being non-binary, the media has gotten better, but it also means that if you're trying to find really good canonical non-binary representation, that can be kind of difficult, not because it's not there, but because it's kind of muddy.
Let me ask you this. Prior to doing research for this and going out of your way to find out what was out there, had there been a character in any medium, be it comic books or novels or TV or movies or whatever that even if they were not necessarily written to be non-binary that spoke to you, it sort of connected in that way?
So yes. There are a couple of these are actually canonical, but again, they're from like pretty recent, the last like 2 or 3 years. I think a lot of people like myself who grew up in the early 90s and did not identify as female and were sort of trying to figure out what that meant about ourselves. I think a lot of us had our first sort of queer awakening reading The Song of the Lioness, the Alana Quartet, written by Tamara Pierce. I think that was just like a really formative experience. I think for a lot of young people, young women, young queer people, and young non-binary and trans people. But I think that, at least for myself, it got pretty disheartening. The later the books went on, the more you started to realize, oh, this character who I thought might be like me, super isn't. Super duper isn't. She really, really, really is into guys, and she really wants to wear dresses, and the fact that she can't do it just hurts her so much. And it was like, okay. That was nice while it lasted. I think a lot of people also felt that way about Mulan, although with less of the betrayal.
Yeah, I mean, given that was Disney, I don't think anyone necessarily had the expectation there.
No, and in that case, it was very much like, oh, this is a person who I can kind of sort of squint and be like, there's something there. There's something in like reflections that just like really gets to me, and I just can't figure out why, because I'm 11 and being raised in a heteronormative cisgendered society, and I don't understand how to process the emotions that I'm having from this, which are apparently very different from everyone else who's watching it.
Well, it's funny when you think back at the stuff that you gravitated to as a kid, and then you start connecting dots. You're like, oh my god.
I think we all look back on our childhoods and be like, wow, I wonder how I missed this. And then you just have to remind yourself, it's the cisnormativity.
Yeah.
it's the heteronormativity. Like that's what it was.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. The big one right now is the character of Taylor Mason on the show Billions. This is, I think it's on Showtime. They're making the claim of not the first non-binary character, but they're making the claim of the first regularly appearing non-binary character in a mainstream U.S. television show, which I think they might be able to claim.
Okay. I have never heard of this show, so this is also completely outside of my worldview. It's
like I've never seen it, but it's like a financial thriller kind of show. It's like a skeevy banker trying to outsmart basically the Federal Trade Commission or something to that effect.
Okay.
But also the character is played by a non-binary actor.
Nice.
Asia Kate Dillon, who apparently had their breakout role on Orange is the New Black, which just gives me one more reason that I wish I liked that show. Because
me too. I can't stand it. But it has Ruby Rose in it.
It has Ruby Rose and it has Asia Kate Dillon, and it was the breakout for oh my god, now I've forgotten her name.
Laverne Cox.
Thank you.
I also had a moment of like queer panic. Like, oh no, I'm gonna lose my card.
It was the launching pad for all these people, and I'll appreciate it for that, but I just didn't like the show. Well, part of what I found interesting was that most of, certainly the more recent non-binary characters that I could find were actually being played by, if not non-binary, at least trans people or people who were not cisgender. Mm-hmm. So, and I have to wonder if part of that is it because like the understanding of non-binary as even being a thing is, at least in the mainstream, is so relatively recent. If that just happens to coincide with the point in time where people like, homosexuals and lesbians and trans people are saying we need to be playing ourselves, that is far enough along that at the time non-binary characters are even kind of happening, that push has already happened, and so it's happening right off the bat for that. I have to wonder.
I think probably, especially for for at least in the case of in John Wick 3, they said that the character was not originally intended to be non-binary, but when a non-binary actor came in and said, "Hi, I would like to, read for this role," and they were like, "They're fantastic, they're incredible, they're amazing," that then sort of the next thought was, well, hang on a second, why does this character have to be female? They don't have
that's
to be,
awesome.
which is
that's
amazing.
Just awesome.
So that is one of those cases of actually making a character non-binary after the fact in order to have, because you're like, well, now we have this chance to have a non-binary actor portraying themselves in a certain way, which I think is like awesome, and is almost sort of what we should aspire to in a certain sense. I'm not like completely bothered by the concept of cis people playing non-binary characters, but it is nice to have non-binary, or at the very least queer people, telling these stories.
Like, I think, because I have, and I'm on the record as having some very serious issues with cisgender people playing transgender characters.
Don't do that. Yeah.
But see, it is worth making a distinction, I think, at least on some level, because since non-binary representation is fairly recent, it doesn't have the historical baggage that screwed up trans representation does in the first place. Mm-hmm. And the implications of having a cisgender actor aren't quite as gross, because part of the problem with having a cis actor play a trans character is it reinforces the idea of, oh, well, they're really still the gender they were assigned at birth, because you're casting someone, and they pretty much always cast someone who is the same gender as the character was assigned at birth.
Yeah.
And with non-binary...
This is, of course, most egregious with trans women, because there's this long history of trans women are just desperate gay men, and there's just a long history of transphobia and homophobia and all sorts of stuff that goes into that, which non-binary people, by sort of like sliding under the radar, have sort of managed to mostly avoid. Mostly people think that we're just lesbians, which is also not accurate, except that the lesbians say that non-binary lesbians can't exist, which is also incorrect. So, yeah.
Oh, the LGBTQ plus infighting. That's always fun.
Oh, it's the best. It honestly is. I love my fellow LGBTQ people like my family.
With all the implications that term has.
Exactly. So
another one that I found that was from something that I recognized. There's a character on the anime Attack on Titan. Called, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, because I did 3 episodes of Attack on Titan and realized it wasn't for me. The character is Zoe Hang, I believe. They're a squad leader, and I don't know what it's like on the anime, but in the original English translation of the manga, it was translated with she, her pronouns. The creator of the original manga, see if I can not butcher this, Hajime Isayama, actually requested that they remove references to any specific gender, which not only did they do for all of the volumes that hadn't been released yet, on reprints of the ones they had released, they also fixed that.
Nice. I also have some pretty serious problems with Attack on Titan, and like with you, it's super not for me. But I do really appreciate that. Props to the creator for actually saying, actually no, please stop misgendering this character. We have a singular, like, non-gendered pronoun in Japanese, and I would appreciate it if you actually used the correct pronouns, or the best equivalent that you have in English. So kudos to everyone involved on that.
Actually, that's interesting. I didn't realize that they had a gender-neutral singular in Japanese, which
Japan
of course
is crazy because they have like 17 pronouns, which is like both awesome and kind of horrifying.
So, I mean, I've been throwing out a few. What were some that you had come across?
So I sort of broke mine down into two chunks. That there are the sort of ambiguous, up to interpretation, kind of more headcanon options.
Yeah.
Which I definitely wanted to start with, mostly because I wanted to talk about my wife, Brienne of Tarth. I don't watch Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones sucked me in for 2 episodes, and I'm pretty sure you know what 2 I'm talking about. And then they kicked me out. Me personally, I'm not allowed back in because they ruined everything that I love. 2 things. Brienne of Tarth deserves happiness, and Brienne of Tarth deserves respect. Just facts. And if she does not get the ending that she has definitely earned, I'm going to personally find George R.R. Martin and have words.
Here's what I'm going to recommend. Read the book and hope that the book does it better than the show did.
Yeah, I've been keeping vaguely involved with the books because I have one friend who watches the show and keeps me updated, mostly about things involving Brienne. And I have a friend who's reading the books or has read the books and keeps me updated about Brienne. So, I mean, the book trajectory is going better. So
Then maybe the landing will be better too, because the show not so much.
But I wanted to talk about her a little bit because I've heard some implications that Brienne does not entirely identify as female. And this is a thing that I wanted to talk about because it's a really common trope in non-binary representation, and I wanted to sort of address it a little bit.
Sure.
Because this falls into the Alanas, the Mulans, things like that, that a lot of non-binary stories or stories that can be read as being about non-binary people often involve this like really strong rejection of femininity, which is a little bit troubling for a couple of reasons, because on the one hand, it sort of reinforces the assumption that in order to be non-binary, you must reject gender norms entirely. Like, you're not allowed to have them. You're not allowed to keep anything from whatever like gender you were assigned at birth, which can be really damaging to a lot of, I mean, even to binary trans people who are like, yes, I am a man. I have transitioned. I use he, him pronouns, but I like to bake. And all of a sudden people are like, well, that's because you're still secretly girly on the inside. It's like, it also reinforces that the only way to be non-binary is to be androgynous. That you need to be this like vaguely masculine-ish, sort of like genderless creature in order to be non-binary, which can also be somewhat damaging.
I mean, like, that's some people's jam, obviously, but that the minute you start saying this is the only way to be something, that's usually
especially for something that has as broad of like an umbrella as non-binary. Like, you're everyone who does not identify as male or female or both male and female. Like, everybody else is allowed to just chill. Then placing restrictions on what a non-binary person is, that like all non-binary people are assigned female at birth, untrue, and hate being women. Maybe like a little bit, but that's just such a reductive way of understanding things. So I definitely wanted to give this a shout out because I love Brienne as a character, and she sort of typifies like the best option of this sort of representation. Also, I just love her. I love her, and I mostly wanted to make the joke that her gender is knight. Her pronouns are sir, sirs, and her sexual orientation is justice.
So, what's interesting when you talk about like the rejection of femininity, I think there's like a little tweak of it with Brienne, like versus something like Mulan, or, you know, something where it's a more active rejection, either because they don't want it or because it's something that's not safe for them under the circumstances that they're in. The sense I get from Brienne, if she has any rejection of her femininity, it's because those things wouldn't help her do what she wants to do.
Exactly.
So it's not a hatred of femininity, it's just, well, that doesn't help me be a better knight, so no, that can stay behind.
Exactly, and that's why I think that she is sort of a cut above the archetypical girl pretends to be boy in order for whatever story, which unfortunately is what we had for like decades.
Well, I would say centuries, because you can go to Shakespeare for that.
God, Viola.
There was a recent movie called Upgrade that has a character named Jamie who's a hacker, and requests that their gender not be asked for, and makes it clear that Jamie is a chosen name, not a birth one. And again, that is a case where the actor, Kay Bradley, is non-binary. So that had that again, which was cool.
Excellent.
And then, like, I found a number of things that were interesting, but, like, this is stuff nobody will have heard of. So, like, there was a vampire web series called Carmilla.
Carmilla is great!
Oh,
What are you talking about?
I had never heard of it before I looked this up.
It has non-binary lesbians in it. That's where I learned the concept of non-binary lesbians.
Well,
Carmilla's great.
Okay, well, there you go, because they've got two on there, I believe. They've got Fontaine and they've got Caitlin, who are both non-binary, and I believe the actors are as well, or at the very least for La Fontaine is. The other one I couldn't confirm just because they don't like have a social media presence at all.
Just they're a more private person.
Yeah.
So it's like.
But yeah, that was one I hadn't heard of before. I mean, this is a name I recognize, but like I wasn't ever gonna watch this. So apparently in Degrassi Next Class,
okay,
there's a non-binary character in that. Now that character is played by a cis female actress, but was actually, as I said, one of the very few instances where I found of a cis actor playing a non-binary. So I'm actually not even gonna like hold it against them so much, because it's not like, oh god, this friggin' trend, because like it's not a trend. The trend is actually the correct way to do it. So
yeah.
Apparently there was a crowdfunded show in Canada called The Switch, which like had a complete
trans and non-binary cast.
Yeah,
like
cast and creator.
Awesome.
And actually was the only instance that I could find in a piece of entertainment of using pronouns other than they, them. I believe they had a character that used ze-zer for their pronouns, which, boy, I wonder how many people's minds we just blew with that. Like, yes, there are a number of, none of them have caught on as yet, but there are a number of.
They is the go-to, because it's both the most common, but also functions as an umbrella.
Yeah.
In a situation where you're like, I'm pretty sure that you don't use he or she, but we're in a situation where I don't necessarily feel comfortable asking, so they is usually a safe guess, and it's generally accepted as like, yeah, you can go with that. But it's sort of like referring to people as non-binary in general, that non-binary for some people like myself, that's like my specific chosen, like preferred identity and nomenclature. But there are other people who are like, you can call me non-binary, but I'd rather more say gender fluid. I think that's a little more accurate, or agender. I think that's more accurate. So both non-binary and they can function in the specific or in the general.
Yeah.
Context.
And I think part of the reason that it goes to they as well is like, it's also a word people already know. It's a slightly different usage, but it's not literally having to learn whole new words as with some of the singular gender neutrals that have tried to get going in English, and as I said, none of them have really stuck. Now, so you brought up, the people who are kind of, for lack of a better term, like non-specified, and the headcanon, which I figured there was going to be a bit of, because I ran into this when I had the conversation about asexuality, which was oftentimes you have the people who need that representation latch on to anyone who it just isn't specified, and that happens with asexual quote-unquote representation a lot.
Absolutely.
Where people will just headcanon someone who doesn't have a romantic pairing at all, like, oh, maybe that one.
Please.
And with non-binary, you get that a little bit. And actually, oddly, where you find that a surprising amount, I found, is in video games. There's a fair number of characters who, either because it doesn't come up or it's not important, and then the way that they are visually designed, you just don't know. Mm-hmm. Including one lead character. I've never played Undertale.
Yes.
But
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I forgot about the lead from Undertale. I don't remember what their name is, but yeah, that's
Frisk.
Yes, Frisk. That's a great example.
Is never specified as being either male or female, and the sprite you can't tell.
Yep. Just a kid.
Which, again, is not to say that the character is necessarily specifically intended to be non-binary, but it does allow you freedom to it's the ideal sort of player avatar. Like, are you male? Are you female? You can see them that way. Are you neither? You can see them that way. And it's a good use of the medium and the kind of things that video games can do that other things can't.
Yes.
Honestly.
I did want to give one shout out still to the Dragon Age series, which is that in the Dragon Age series, in the character creator, there are some non-binary options that while you do still pick male or female to be your base character, and that will give you your build options for like the musculature, like their physicality, and also their voice options. If you pick a female avatar, you can still give her an Adam's apple. If you pick a female avatar, you can give her facial hair. So there are some things that video games are slowly starting to add into those customizable characters, and of course there's Sims 4, which just blew all of the boxes out of the water. Like, if you're making a character, everything is selectable. There are no correlations. There is no, you're going to pick a male body, which means that this person will not have, defined breasts. This person will have, masculine appearances or body shape. No, all of that stuff is customizable. Just because you pick a male voice does not mean you're going to get any sort of requirements on whether or not that character can become pregnant. So that is a cool thing, and I want to give a shout out to The Sims 4 for making essentially every randomly generated NPC in Sims, like any character that you make just by hitting random, they're almost certainly going to be non-binary, because they don't pick a gender for you at start. They'll just go through and randomly select traits.
That, I actually hadn't heard about that one. That is very cool. And actually, given how big The Sims is, I'm kind of surprised that didn't waft back at me at any point.
Yeah, it was a pretty big deal, and there were some people who were big mad about it.
Oh, I'm sure there were. And there was, this is off the top of my head, this didn't come up in my research, so I may be misremembering this. So if I get it wrong, someone will correct me in the comments, I'm sure, because they always do. So I think it was the Saints Row series. Now, they didn't keep this, but I think it was in the second game, because you got to customize your protagonist in those. And in the second game, they had gender as a slider bar.
Oh, nice. Nice.
But then when they got to the third one, they went back to having you, hard pick one or the other. Another thing I came across, and I want to get your opinion on this. What is your feeling about the instances of characters who are non-binary, but also aren't human?
So this is the other big thing. This is I would say the single most common canonical non-binary trope. Everything else is, sort of tropes about assumptions that people have, or like, is this character non-binary? Maybe, maybe not. What's the, like, evidence for that?
Yeah.
This is the one of just the absolute most common and probably also most frustrating stereotype is this character is not of a binary gender. Excellent. Because they're an inhuman robot or an alien or lack a physical form of any variety. And here's the thing. A lot of those characters are awesome. I have one of them on my, like, canonical, recent, like, current non-binary characters list. Janet from The Good Place is amazing.
Oh, she's fantastic.
I love her so much. Like, she's great. Jadzia Dax, for example, would be a non-binary character because Jadzia's, like, gender is a thing that changes over time. Her species does not have the same concept of maleness and femaleness being tied to your biology the way that we do. They still have gender expectations, but in a different way. The problem with all of that is that having a person with a gender that they insist frequently, they either do not have a gender, or their gender is different, or they want people to stop assuming their gender, is because they're not human, and it's a thing that sets them apart from the other characters in a kind of backhanded way. I'm saying, well, of course Janet doesn't have a gender because she's a concept.
Yeah.
She's not a person.
I mean, that's she so frequently reiterates, not a girl.
Not a girl, but also not a robot, not a
But that's
person.
Yeah, not a girl because also not a human, so not really prepared to be defined by the human terms in the first place, like any of them.
Yeah, and I have fingers crossed for The Good Place because the people writing that show are both very smart and very empathetic. So my hopes is that as the show goes on, that a lot of Janet's character arc has been connecting more to humanity and becoming more human, becoming more than what she has been in the past. So if she gains more humanity, becomes more of a person, and stops insisting that she's not a person, but still insists that she's not a girl, that would be awesome. That's what we're aiming for. So I'm very hopeful that they're going to go in that direction, that they're going to sort of recognize some of the troubling implications that this type of representation has and grow from it and allow her as a character to grow. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful about Janet. There is a book called, this one is actually A Closed and Common Orbit, but it is in the Wayfarers series by Becky Chambers. The first book of that was The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. And it is it's highly recommended, very, very good. It is a book that is very derogatively referred to as a soft science fiction. But as a person who got a degree in a soft science, I'm very excited about it because it's actually very accurate. That it takes soft science concepts of gender theory and sociology and political theory and apply economics, things like that, and applies them in the same way that physics would be applied in a science fiction story. So there's a lot of very intense world building specifically that has to do with social norms and rules and societies and how people interact. So in that series, Zir is the agreed on, like, basic gender neutral pronoun because aliens exist in that society. And a lot of aliens use he and she because they have sexual dimorphism. Some aliens do not. And as a result, either their gender changes over time or they have not just more than two genders, they actually have more than two sexes. So one of the species, the major alien species that exists in this world are the Aluans, who are a sort of like fish-like species.
Okay.
And so as a couple things about them, they do not speak, and they're all deaf. They communicate entirely through color.
Huh.
Oh God, it's so cool. So the way that their society functions is very alien because they never had spoken language until they made contact with aliens. And when they made contact with aliens, they got technology they used to like augment themselves so that they could actually communicate. So they have like translators so that they can hear other people and so that they can quote unquote speak. And a thing that's very cool about them is that they actually have 4 sexes because they're an egg-laying species. So they have those that produce eggs, those that fertilize eggs, those that are infertile and have neither. So that would be, okay, that's your third, that's your non-binary. And those that move between them. So this is a reflection of like real world things like with clownfish, where they can like change sex depending on like the social, or not the social factors, but the environmental factors on the school. And in this world, those factors aren't environmental, they're social, and to a certain degree biological. And so there is a character by the name of Tak, T-A-K, who is one of these 4th gender individuals. And it means that Zir will go from masculine to neutral to feminine to neutral to masculine and back and forth throughout the course of the book on like a pretty regular cycle. So you have one character who is referred to by 3 different sets of pronouns based on the time of year that it is.
Huh.
And there's some like really cool stuff that goes on with gender in that book with Eluans because the way that they present themselves is the way that you refer to them. End of story. So if one of these 4th gender persons is like physically presenting as being masculine, you use he, him. You do not use zir. You don't include any sort of ambiguity in that situation because it's like, nope, I'm male right now, and you will address me as such. And in 9 months, I will probably be female, and you will address me as such. So that was like a cool thing because in their culture, there are people who use zir. Flat. That's it. And they're like, that's not my gender.
Huh.
So it takes non-binary and to a certain degree sort of breaks down like there are people who have binary genders, then there are non-binary people, and then there are gender fluid people, like at a biological level, which is like kind of really cool.
That I would say that's really cool.
But that is a very common thing. A lot of the characters who I found who were either gender fluid or non-binary, like just not cis and not binary trans, like the 2 things that I think our society has sort of come to like accept, like, okay, so there's cis people and there's binary trans people, and even if we don't like those trans people, we get them.
Yeah.
I think our society in America definitely has a long way to go before it recognizes that there's more options than that.
Well, and the thing is, non-binary or gender fluid or anything of that, or agender or anything of that nature is fundamentally more disruptive to what had been the societal understanding of gender than transgender is. Transgender was still disruptive, but it was still going between the known sides of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So to say that, well, no, your entire foundation is wrong, we got to blow all this up, that's much more threatening, for lack of a better term.
Yes. Do you want me to get sociopolitical here on your channel a little bit? Awesome.
Go for it.
Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to Gender 101. If you didn't know that binary trans people have always existed throughout all of history, they have. If you did not know that non-binary people have also existed through all of history, welcome to class. Because there are a wide variety of societies who have had more than 2 genders here on Earth with living human people for centuries and in some cases millennia. not to get too far out into the weeds, but a lot of this comes back to colonialism, because when Western persons encountered people from, say, Mexico, who would say that they are mushi, it's like, what does that mean? It's M-U-X-E. It's like, well, it's like mujer, but masculine. So you're a masculine lady. Yes. I don't get that, and I don't like that. There's a long history of people from a variety of societies where those societies have had 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. genders. And the interesting thing about a lot of these like social groups is that they could be filled by intersex people, non-binary people, binary trans people, people that today we would still probably consider cis, but within their own society, people recognize, no, there's something else, something that we probably don't even have a word for. So I just think that that is super cool, super awesome, and a thing that I can sort of cling to. That even though right now in America we have very strict assumptions about gender identity, and even though the history of trans people and of non-binary people is so sort of sequestered away in these tiny little pockets that have survived, it still does exist. And we do still have a history that goes back millennia, that goes back to India and Africa and the Middle East and Mexico and Albania. Albania has one of the coolest like gender concepts that I've ever come across, which was the concept of a sworn virgin, which we would essentially probably consider to be trans men.
Okay.
But they very specifically exist outside of masculinity and femininity. And even though these people dress in a masculine fashion, are usually referred to as like in male contexts and with male terms, if asked, they will say like, no, we're not men, we're something else. And they exist in this sort of this neither sphere. And it's a thing that's, as these sections of rural Albania have become more cosmopolitan, is actually sort of fading away. Let's see, the Fa'afafine of Polynesia, who are the third neither masculine nor feminine persons. There is the entirety of the Two-Spirit identity, which has been largely reclaimed by a lot of Indigenous American people, who we would consider maybe queer, trans, non-binary, but they have their own language that they have sort of retained for themselves and are very, very proud of. And I'm just like so stoked that like their own history has been preserved like within their own community. It's awesome. Let's see. Oh, here's one that I found about Vedic India, which I like for more philosophical reasons, that in India in the like 4th and 5th century CE, a lot of things that had to do with natural philosophy, so early sciences, talked about the 3 natural genders, and that the 3 natural genders extended to everything, that the universe was made of masculine, feminine, and neuter energy, that animals existed in feminine, masculine, and neuter situations, that plants could be feminine, masculine, or neuter, and that people were also feminine, masculine, or neuter.
That is very cool.
So it's not.
Actually,
so it's not only is being non-binary within this like concept of existence, not only is it not disruptive, it is the definition of balance, that trans and non-binary and intersex people are essential to the balance of the cosmos. Not to be totally narcissistic, but I really like the idea that like we're the ones holding it all together.
That is
like at
fun.
a cosmic level, like we're the ones who keep like the universe on balance. I don't know how much like personal talk we're going to get into later, but like that was my coming out, because I took a Gender 101 sociology class, and my super awesome, like 65-year-old Jewish professor was like, hey guys, did you know that in a lot of societies there are 3 genders, not 2? And I went, It was like it's basically the best day of my life. So anytime I can talk about the Albanian sworn virgins, I probably will.
So like the last couple that I've got are a couple of samples that I pulled for problematic. So I don't want to dive into that right off. So I'll kind of just hand over the reins, and whatever sort of things we haven't already brought up, that because I know you have lots and lots of notes. So
oh God, I have so many notes. I'm going to go back into some of my ambiguous characters then, because if you're going to talk about problematic stuff, I want to talk about anime. Anime and Japanese culture in general has a long transphobic history, and it's super unfortunate. So one of my sort of maybe canonical characters is the character of Krona from the anime Soul Eater, which I love. And I love Krona. Like, I think that they're like a really interesting, very tragic, like super cool character. In this particular instance, Krona's lack of a distinct gender identity is a result of abuse, which is not great.
Yeah.
As like a one-to-one, but it is a valid character choice in this context, and I think is a very interesting thing to bring up. Like I said, with the Attack on Titan character, Japanese has a singular gender-neutral pronoun. And that is the one that even when Krona, originally an antagonist, becomes one of the protagonists and one of the supporting characters, continues to use the singular pronoun, the singular gender-neutral. And everyone else is very sort of confused about this, because they're like, well, you've gotten out of this like terrible situation. Wouldn't you kind of want to actually start presenting as whatever your true gender is? And they say, no, I don't have any desire to do that, actually. I'm kind of okay with how I am now, and I'm like just sort of starting to work on my like trauma. So I'm not really interested in picking a new gender at the moment. And everyone else is sort of like, okay, weird but cool. In the English dub, they gave Krona male pronouns.
Ah, yeah, of course.
Why? Because obviously this is a case of a boy being forced to act in some way feminine as a form of abuse. And I'm like, great, awesome, great. Wonderful.
You know what I just realized is there's a potential non-binary character in my favorite anime show, and for some reason that didn't ping my radar. It's not as widely known as I would like, but Escaflowne is...
I so need to watch that. Like, I literally don't know anything about it, but I know it's very good.
That is my favorite anime. And there is a villain character. I haven't rewatched it in ages, so I cannot remember. I think that they use masculine pronouns to refer to him, but the original Japanese, I don't remember what they did with the English dub, because the English this was dubbed over in like the late 90s, early 2000s, when the dubs were still terrible. So it's one of the few.
Don't worry. We'll get back to terrible dubs in like 4 minutes.
It's one of the few that I watch with, because normally I prefer dubs to subtitles. But I watched this one with the subtitles, and in Japanese, the character is voiced by a woman, and has a very it is always in armor. So like whatever secondary sex characteristics there are, you can't tell.
Yeah, who knows?
There's a lot of androgynous villains.
Yeah, so that's the thing. There's a lot of androgynous villains, or there are a lot of female characters who are androgynous because androgyny is considered attractive. So just because a character is androgynous or dresses androgynously does not necessarily mean that they are non-binary. That's a lot of times just a shortcut for, hey, look, this character is hot, which also then coincides in a very weird and uncomfortable way with sexy woman villain.
Yeah.
Where there's a lot of villainesses that are very androgynous, where you go, okay, so there's some sexism bleeding into this, which is really unfortunate and unfortunately common. There's also a lot of very campy, over the top character designs that will go for villains and antagonist characters, which are actually really big transphobic, like, caricatures of drag queens. And the, like, drag queen culture is really looked down on in Japan. At least it has been in the past. I think now it's getting a little bit more acceptance, maybe, but there is a lot of transphobia and homophobia that's tied up in assumptions of men who want to wear dresses, and it can get really super uncomfortable really quickly, which is why the anime Ouran High School Host Club really bothers me, because there's so much potential. And partially because of the nature of the show, because it is a melodrama and a satire, it means that a lot of things are punched up to 11, like, for the sake of a joke. Like, all the characters are an extreme caricature, which unfortunately means that the main character Haruhi is very androgynous in a way that is intended to be, like, attractive, and is occasionally played for laughs in a way that makes me kind of uncomfortable, just due to the premise of the show, because the general conceit of the show is that she is pretending to be a sexy boy in Sexy Boy Club, for plot reasons.
Because anime?
Because anime. And I really like Haruhi as a character, but everything is played up as a joke because everyone assumes that she is a straight man and she is a straight woman. Get it? Which is, like, really frustrating, because there are definitely moments where I was like, you know what, with an updated dub, this could be, like, one of the best queer animes, because there's a lot of moments in there where people are talking to Haruhi just as she is, just in her normal everyday life, where she has short hair and she wears baggy clothes and she basically looks like me. And people are making assumptions of, like, oh, well, you're not in, like, boy clubs, so, like, do I need to, like, treat you like a lady? And she's like, no. And then she'll be in boy club and people will be like, oh, you're this incredible gentleman. And she's like, no. So there's, like, a lot of potential there for, like, having a character who is actively just entirely disinterested in gender and who stands outside of gender and makes fun of all of these over-the-top social expectations of, like, boys have to act like this and girls have to act like that. And having a main character who could stand back and be like, that's all ridiculous, could be awesome. But unfortunately, between the writing that was put into the anime and then the translation, it's not. I mean, I watch it. I watched every episode on Netflix, and it hurt me, but I did it.
Wait, why do we do this to ourselves?
I don't know, but the part that makes me saddest about Ouran High School Host Club is because it has the best canonical queer person in anime. Not Haruhi, because the story makes it pretty clear, like, eventually she's going to grow her hair out and she's going to settle down, which is another queerphobic stereotype, because high school girls like to kiss each other and it's so great and cute, but then you grow up.
It's a phase.
Yeah, great. It's awesome. It's specifically for, like, queer women. And it's just great. It's awesome. Way to go. So not Haruhi, because the story does not bear that out. But Haruhi's dad is the best queer character in anime. Like, canonical. 100%. Haruhi's dad works in an okama bar. Essentially a drag bar, where it's a gay bar, but specifically where the hosts perform in drag. And Haruhi's dad is not only a professional crossdresser, but is canonically bisexual. And is awesome. Ranka Fujioka has no time for your anything. There's this like running joke that all anime dads are like the literal pits. Like they're all the worst. They're all like yelling at their kids to get in the mech because they need to get in the robot and fight angels, or like piecing off and like leaving their children with a bunch of emotional baggage, or like literally leaving cursed objects in their will and then like initiating this whole journey where you need to go deal with your daddy issues. Like anime dads are the worst, except for Ranka Fujioka, who is the best, who is not only 100% like caring for her daughter, like being like totally involved, emotionally available, like protective, but in like a very reasonable manner, even when like crazy, weird, random hijinks happen. That is the like shot in the dark of like, oh, you weren't trying to make a character who is like realistic and honest and good and high quality and just generally who I love, who's not some sort of crazy, weird stereotype, and you did it. Like, oh my God, you did it. How?
I suspect that they accidentally stumbled into awesomeness.
Oh, absolutely. Because the absolute worst part of Ouran High School Host Club is the way that they decided to translate the word Okama. When they go to Haruhi's apartment and meet her father, all of the boys go, oh, her dad is a tranny.
Oh my God.
And they say it every single time she is on the show.
So, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go grab a torch and a pitchfork, and I'm going to go hunt down some translators. Oh my God.
Because what it should be translated as is queer. And even if you want to say that in like a weird derogatory way, like gross, but okay.
There's a massive difference because queer can be a pejorative, but it's also been reclaimed by at least a portion of the community. Nobody's reclaiming tranny. Everyone is trying to leave that behind.
Nobody wants it, especially because, as Ranka specifically states, frequently, she's not gay. She's not interested in transitioning. She will still occasionally use he, him pronouns depending on the context. She just likes being pretty and being allowed to go about her daily life as she wishes.
Oh, that just harshed my mellow.
I know. I'm so frustrated always because, like, that could be, like, the best gay anime, like, of all time. Because, like, but nope. It's got to be too mired down in assumptions and stereotypes for its own good. So I just have to sit here and grit my teeth and try and love it through the pain.
The worst stuff that I came across, since we seem to have backed into that.
Mm-hmm. Don't worry, I've got good stuff on the other end. I've got like queer stuff by queer people.
Oh, good.
Like, I can save this. I
so,
promise.
And thankfully, this seems to not be happening much anymore. But it's, when non-binary characters show up in comedies, it's pretty much always as a punchline of some sort.
Yeah.
So I didn't watch this because I had no interest, but apparently in Zoolander 2...
Yeah, I was going to ask if Benedict Cumberbatch was
his character called All.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a mockery. Now I'll
conceptually I like All, but again, if All was written and performed by a queer person, if All was performed by who they should have been performed by, which is Justin Vivian Bond, that would have been amazing.
The thing is, I can't get super ticked off at that because I don't think it's born out of malice. It's born out of ignorance. Like, They had the idea and didn't bother to look into it all. They just did it as the idea as they had it.
I think this is why, like, cis hetero creators, if they're doing a comedy that involves gay jokes, they need to ask actual gay people, because that's the worst thing about, like, gay characters and queer characters and trans characters in comedy is the writers don't know what's funny.
Yeah.
Like, there are jokes that can be made. Ranka Fujioka weirdly manages to make one of my favorite, like, trans jokes ever when the boys show up at her house and she's, like, just gotten home from work, like, maybe 3 hours ago, because it's, like, 6 o'clock in the morning. And, like, she's got, like, her little tiny mustache and, like, her hair's all down and she's got bags under her eyes and she just opens the door and is like, what? Like some sort of bog hag. And the boys are all like, I am so sorry, sir. I had the wrong apartment. And she goes, who are you calling sir? Just because a lady doesn't have her face on. Like, that's amazing. That's great. Like, awesome. That's, like, legitimately fun.
And that's about, like, a couple months ago, ContraPoints had a video basically pointing out that the problem with gay and trans jokes is they are stupid and lazy because they're being made by people who don't understand. Because to make fun of something properly, you need to understand it. Otherwise, you're just going, huh, that's weird, and, you know.
Yeah. And then, where's the joke?
Yeah, exactly. You're just pointing at it as something and going, right? Right? Like, no, that's not a joke. But speaking of jokes, so the recurring character on Saturday Night Live, known as Pat.
Oh, why did you remind me that Pat existed?
Because, regrettably, I suspect that is still some people's mental image of a non-binary person. And to be fair, aside from, like, a bad fashion sense, the visualization isn't awful, but the entire running joke is, oh, we can't tell, isn't it so funny that nobody can tell?
Yeah. It's that fun, we don't have a joke or really a character, but we can objectify you.
Yeah.
And that's going to be funny for people who aren't you. Yeah, that's a fun one.
So, having sort of
taken us to the depths of Pat.
Well, you know, to sort of yank a phrase from my occasional sponsor, Radio versus the Martians, we've done the bottom of the barrel. Let's go to the top of the mountain. What are some of your favorites? Okay.
This is where I get to be really excited. So, you asked earlier about a character who sort of was maybe sort of like a first experience of like a canonical non-binary character or something like that, and I said Alana, because to a certain extent that was true. Mm-hmm. But as it turned out, it was a sham. It was a sham and I was tricked. It was not her intention, but man, did I feel betrayed. The first actual canonical non-binary character who I encountered and immediately latched onto was the Shining Knight. And this was a character from the New 52 in DC Comics in like 2010, 2011-ish. I was in college. I'd been out of buying comics for well over a decade at that point, because the last comic I'd probably bought when I was like 6. And I was just looking at all of these new titles that were going to be starting, and one of them was something called Demon Knights. And I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. I like fantasy stories, so I guess I'll pick up this comic. It's not going to be tied into anything else. It won't matter what, like, the Batman continuity is, or, it's not going to be crossing over a bunch with crazy things. I'll get that. And it was basically D&D, the comic book. It's amazing. I love it. the golden age shining knight was just a knight named Justin. Very, very golden age, very 1930s.
Yes.
But Grant Morrison said, well, basically, let's do an Alana story. Let's be like, okay, so this character wanted to be a knight, and so she pretended to be a boy so that she could be Lancelot's squire, so she could be near him. And I'm like, okay, whatever. It's an interesting series, and I quite like it, but the only reason I really like it is actually because of Paul Cornell's take on the character in the New 52, in which Yston is a canonically non-binary and perhaps intersex character. And this is just like a great representation, or a great example of straight cis writers somehow managing to write like really, really good characters, because the question of Yston's gender originally did start off as a joke to like basically all and sundry, because he rolls up into a tavern and is like, "What ho, everyone! I am the greatest and strongest and most valiant knight of Camelot. Look at me and all of my great, mighty, manly deeds." And everyone's like, that's clearly like a 17-year-old girl. Like, that person is like the weediest, scrawniest little like turd that I've ever seen in my entire life. But I guess he's a man. Sure, if you insist. And over time, the jokes dropped off, and everyone were like, no, that's just Yston. That's just how he is. He's just like that. And at one point, Yston is injured. And in a very Mulan-esque moment, you sort of see, you know, his armor has been taken off, and he's laying in the bed, and there are like nuns or priests or whatever who are sort of like trying to tend to his injuries and call in one of the other members of the team, like, so we need to have a discussion because I've never seen this before. Your companion is okay, but I'm not sure what he is. And that's the end of the discussion. So there is an ambiguity, and people got on Twitter or in interviews have asked Paul Cornell, like, so what's up with Yston? And he actually had a very classy response, which was, I'm not going into details about this character's genitals. Like, you don't need to know.
That like, makes me so happy.
Way to go, dude. He was like, it doesn't matter what Yston would count as in our modern parlance or how he would consider himself here. In the story, he is a man. He has breasts. He's attracted to women. And you don't need to know what's in his pants. End of discussion. It's a great example of show don't tell and managing to be like historically accurate in a story. Because a lot of people will say like, well, I can't include this character because of the setting. Or I don't want to include a character because I don't want it to be offensive because I'm not going to have our modern terminology to discuss this. And it's like, well, treat it like you would treat any other aspect of the character and allow them to explain themselves. Speaking of cis male characters writing really good non-binary characters, I want to talk about podcasts, because podcasts and webcomics and web shows, like
I actually stopped writing down webcomic examples because I'm like, there's too many of these.
There's too many. That's the thing. They have been, because they have such low gatekeeping standards, that's the place that queer people have been telling their own stories for like a decade, 2 decades.
Yeah.
Like that's where our stories has been in webcomics for years. And with the rise of podcasting and of fiction podcasting specifically, that's been sort of the new frontier in queer storytelling. So first I want to talk about my favorite podcasters ever, the McElroys. And if anyone here knows me personally or has listened to any podcast that
I
I've
should
done,
have known you were going to
fan.
find a way to bring them up. I should have called that. I'm annoyed with myself that I'm surprised that you are bringing them up and that you found a way to do it.
You legitimately should have known better.
Yes,
so,
yeah, I really should have.
We're friends on Facebook. You know these things.
Yeah.
So in their Dungeons & Dragons podcast, The Adventure Zone, another example of having a non-binary character in like a fantasy medieval-esque setting, a non-modern setting. One of the characters that they created was an elemental creature by the name of Roswell. And Roswell used they/them pronouns. And Roswell was awesome. Again, this is an example of the trope is not the problem itself. It's the pervasiveness of the trope that's the problem. Because this is one of those cases of Roswell is not human. Yeah. Roswell is not a single person. Roswell is a literal object, but a sentient object. And as a sentient object, could have a gender, but doesn't. And there could have been a lot of pitfalls that this character fell into, but because they intentionally were like, we're going to make Roswell a cool, interesting, like, badass character with their own, like, goals and aspirations and ideals and thoughts. It's a good example. Roswell's a good character, but still falls into some of these traps of like, well, but, technically they're not human, and yeah, they're sentient, and especially in a fantasy world where, you have elves and dwarves and stuff, like, just because you're not human doesn't mean you're not a person. Like, that's not a connotation within the world. It's still sort of a connotation in the real world. So you could probably do better. And they said, yeah, you know what? I think we can do better. So in their current arc that they are doing, which is set in modern day West Virginia, hilariously, because they're all from West Virginia. It's two of them still live in West Virginia. It's the wild, far off fantasy world of literally the next county over. It's set in Pocahontas County, which is like 25 minutes away from where Justin lives. Poor man. There is a character in that show who is a motorcycle riding monster hunter named Hollis. And Hollis is awesome. Hollis is great. Hollis takes no guff. Hollis has a thick accent, and Hollis has a baseball bat. And Hollis is basically Steve from Stranger Things of Adventure Zone Amnesty, and they're great. They're great, and I love them.
Steve was the only good thing about the second season of that show, so you sold that to me very well.
That's all you need. That's all you need. Imagine Steve, but like with 14 other like bike gang buddies who all act really tough, but they're all just like soft West Virginia boys. Like, it's great. It's great. This is the big like podcast example, and I'm surprised like it's so entrenched like in my corner of podcasting that I'm really surprised that more people don't know about it. But there is a show called The Penumbra Podcast.
Okay.
And it is also a fiction podcast. It originally started off as a Twilight Zone pastiche, where they would do their own sort of Twilight Zone-esque takes on different genre stories, most of them being sort of horror. But their literal first episode was a story called Juno Steele and the Case of the Murderous Mask, and it was a noir pastiche. And that two-part story ended up being the runaway hit of the podcast. By like episode 8, everyone was in love with Juno. They would do 2 episodes of Juno and then something else. He is a non-binary, bisexual, depressed detective on Mars.
That I love that as a final capper to end on Mars. Yeah, because of course.
Because why not? Juno Steele is, as a result, the longest running character that's been in that series, and thus is the character who also has the most depth. Notable aspects about Juno Steel is that he does use he, him pronouns, but he very insistently refers to himself as a lady. So he is actually the femme fatale of the series.
Oh, that's nice.
He is the suave lady who sweeps in a cloud of smoke and ruins everyone else's life, but he's also the protagonist, which means that then the people who care about him have to deal with the fact that they love this depressed bisexual disaster who is actively destroying his own life and hoping that no one notices. It's great. It's a wonderful story. It's super compelling. He is bisexual, as I said, and has a male sort of antagonist, lover. They have a fantastic dynamic, and that very fraught romance is played out in a very realistic way. I would say a surprisingly realistic way, considering that it is about noir detectives who solve alien murders on Mars. It is a very grounded series, and a lot of Juno's mental illness and gender identity and sexual orientation is treated with a lot of respect and honesty because the creators are themselves queer, and in a lot of cases struggling with their own mental illnesses, and bring that understanding and that compassion into their storytelling. Something that they have said occasionally in commentaries is that until assumed all characters on Mars are queer until proven otherwise. Spoilers, they won't be. Literally everyone on Mars is gay or trans or ace or queer or something. There are no cis heteros in space. None. Hyperion City is a interesting place.
I might need to try and find time in my life to check this out.
I'm not saying that everyone needs to listen to the Penumbra podcast, but I honestly feel like everyone needs to listen to the Penumbra podcast, especially if you yourself are not cisgender or straight. Like, you should listen to this because it honestly does feel like coming home. I think I have one more. Who am I? Oh my gosh. I can't believe I almost forgot to talk about Steven Universe on an episode about non-binary representation.
I didn't bring this up because I wasn't sure what to make of it, because this is kind of an amalgam character, at least that I've heard, which was Stevani.
Yes. So we're going to talk about Stevani because the creator, Rebecca Sugar, a couple of years ago came out as non-binary herself and said that a lot of the subtext that people had been picking up on the show, by this point it was like season 2 or 3, something like that, and said that, yes, all of the subtext that people were picking up on about how gem fusion was a representation of relationships, and specifically of explicitly queer relationships. Yes, they were right. All of the gems are canonically non-binary, every single one, because this is one of those examples of, alien biology, that all gems come from a world where it's just gems. There's no sexual dimorphism, so gems are just gems. It's shown that they very much use she, her pronouns out of convenience because they do present themselves femininely and appear physically to look like women, but at the end of the day, that they're rocks. Like, they're literal rocks. The body is a projection, and the body is essentially for them like clothing presentation that they can look however they like. So this is just how a gem is supposed to look, and whether it be a ruby or a sapphire or a pearl or a whatever, like that's just what you look like because that's what you're expected to look like. So in one sense, gems only have one gender, and in essence, each individual type of gem is its own sort of gender, with its own expectations, its own rules. And within that case, gems of different types are not supposed to mix. That's not considered socially acceptable on their world. So every single fusion is thus a queer relationship. It is a relationship between women, but also between non-binary characters, but also groups that are not supposed to be involved in that sort of like emotionally important relationships with one another and like explicitly romantic relationships with one another. But all of that could be sort of hand-waved away as like, well, that's word of God, or it's a technicality, or, well, they don't have any gender, so it doesn't matter. Stevani is actually a fusion, like other gem fusions, except it's a fusion with a human. So for Stevani, they are the representation of the relationship between two major characters, Stephen and Connie, the protagonist and his primary love interest. And as a result, their fusion uses they, them pronouns, whereas other fusions use she, because it's she, fusion, she. So that means that all of Stephen's fusions with any other gem also uses they, them pronouns. And it's a cool function of the show because it allows you to talk about relationships by embodying the relationship in a single character, and then any sort of character conflict that character has is then an example of the relationship conflict. And that can be like within the relationship or the way that it's perceived by others. Some people I have heard are not totally happy with Stevani as a representation of a non-binary character, but like I am pleased as punch. I love Stevani. I think they're like one of the coolest non-binary characters ever. Like in a lot of ways, they appear to be more feminine coded, which, as I said like earlier, is pretty rare. Most people are like, oh, you're a non-binary person, that means you need to look androgynous, which means you need to look masculine. Stevani has like big hair and big hips, and like that's cool. That's just what Stevani looks like. That's what they look like, and they're a they, and that's valid.
Now I have one. This is totally random, but I want to toss this in at the end because I thought this was cute. Now I only have the first volume of this comic. I guess it was originally a webcomic. So Phoebe and Her Unicorn.
I've heard of this, but I don't actually know anything about this. So
it's very cute, and it's ridiculous. It's kind of high energy. It's a fun little thing. So there is a unicorn character introduced, I guess, later on called Infernus, Unicorn of Death.
I love them already.
Who is non-binary and uses they pronouns.
Okay. Okay. See, that's funny. That's funny. That's how you do that.
I had nowhere else to put that. I just wanted to get that in there.
They, them pronouns.
Yeah, I think that's about a good place to wrap up. I cannot thank you enough, not only for talking with me, but for doing a hell of a lot more. This is an episode where I actually did some level of research, and it's still just mainly me sitting back and going, "You know what you're talking about. I'll just be here."
Well, you know what? I was glad to be your expert witness.
I was very happy to have you. So, what do you feel like plugging at the very end?
I think the big one that I'm actually going to plug right now is actually Dorkness to Light, because it is it's kind of my baby. So I started doing one podcast network series with my dad, which is Relatively Geeky, and that's all fun and well and good. But over the last year, I've been devoting a lot more of my time to our little side project, which is called Dorkness to Light. That is Dorkness with an O, not with an A. And it is all about religion and spirituality and pop culture. And I was raised Christian. He is still practicing Christian. And we talk about stuff. So often from a Christian point of view, but also from a pagan or a Jewish or any sort of spiritual tendency that a person might lean towards that they can find in pop culture, and we want to talk about that sort of stuff. And I really like doing that, and I've been meeting a lot of like really cool people on the internet and getting lots of cool feedback about that sort of stuff. So that's the big thing that I've been spending a lot of my time on that I really enjoy doing the most.
Honestly, it kind of warms my heart that was the one you decided to plug harder. Because, like, speaking as someone who is not raised in any religion and doesn't practice, I still love that.
Oh, thank you.
I love that podcast. I think it's amazing.
Well, and this is not going to be a huge surprise probably for anyone who's watching this, but you have written into that show and talked about your
just a
little. Yeah, just a little. Every now and then, third member of the team over here in the corner, but like that's the sort of thing that we love. We love having people's like personal experiences and talking about like this was meaningful to me on like what could be considered a religious level, but I don't practice any sort of religion. We're like, cool, awesome. Like it's a big thing that I believe in as a non-binary person, breaking down walls. I actually want to plug a thing that I'm not on, but one of my like fellow people in this very, 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 very small corner of the internet that is podcasting about religion from a queer perspective, which is a show called Blessed Be the Binary Breakers, which is by a non-binary seminarian. Highly recommended. Avery is super cool, and they're like a really cool person who kind of runs in my general circles, and I wanna plug their stuff. So if you want to hear more stuff about like non-binary people and non-binary people living our lives, that would be probably a really good place to start.
That sounds awesome. Very cool.
I think there's 5 or 6 episodes that are up now. So something like that. But the show is still in its sort of infancy. So like whenever I have a chance to sort of like get a couple numbers boosts, I think that Avery would probably really appreciate it. They just graduated, so like I don't know if they've been checking their download numbers recently, but I'm like, that would be a nice graduation present, have an extra 35 downloads or something.
Every little bit helps. So, Em, thank you again so much for taking the time and for doing this. I'm really glad you said yes.
It was a pleasure. This is great. We need to talk more often.
Oh my God!
Just in
yes.
general, like, are you free? we could just talk. Now I think we should probably wrap for now. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
That was great.
Another huge thanks to Em for joining me on this. Thank you for sticking all the way through it. I hope you will check out some of their things, some of the things that got recommended. I know I now have a list of stuff to check out. You can tell how long ago that was shot because of how much the color is faded in my hair versus what you just saw in the video. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed it. Whatever your thoughts are on anything we talked about, any of the examples cited, any ones that you want to toss into the mix, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Other stuff to do down there as well, like, subscribe, both of which are helpful, and you can keep track of the stuff that gets put out there. You can support me on Patreon, which helps me pay my bills and make the channel bigger and better. Other links down there besides for my social medias and a link to the book I wrote on being gender fluid, etc., etc. Check those out. Click on links or don't. You don't have to, because at the end of the day, you're the council. I'm just running the meetings, and until next time, this council is adjourned.